Hey, welcome to our second ONA Coffee talk for MICE in 2022. I have a really special guest here with me, all the way from Denmark, Emil. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, how did you end up in coffee? What's your background?
So basically, I'm a food scientist. I work with Christian Hansen, so a Danish bioscience company that produces yeast and bacteria for the food industry, along with other industries as well. I'm based in the food part of the business, particularly with fermented beverage cultures. So that would be bacteria and yeast used for fermented beverages. So that would both be wine, it would be beer, it would be fermented tea. We have some probiotics for fermented beverages as well, and for juice products. And then of course also the coffee that we are
Bit of a new thing
talking
getting
about
started
today.
on. What's your day-to-day look like at Christian Hansen?
So I would be technical responsible for some products. So I would have sit on the knowledge on how to apply our cultures in different applications, like the ones that I just mentioned.
So you got a big background in wine, or is it particularly wine that?
Originally, so when I studied food science, I focused a lot on wine fermentation, and on how that affects the flavor of the wine. And before that, I also have a background as a waiter and a wine sommelier. So I did taste a lot of wine during my time.
Do you see big similarities with the wine industry and the coffee industry?
For sure. I really do. It's all these vintage variations. It's coming from a plant where it's so important that you have the right variety, the right terroir, with the right ripeness of the fruit at the right time when you harvest, and then all these processes that you put onto the coffee. The only thing different I see is that coffee is even more complex and have even more processes. Even also after that you have done the processing, you then have to also roast it, and you have to have knowledge on how to brew it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how to serve it for a customer in the end as well.
So when you first went to a coffee farm, what was the first thing that went through your head, coming from a wine industry? Or?
First of all, the origins are just really beautiful, and the people are amazing at these farms, right? So that was my biggest impression, coming to a farm together with Sasa when I first went to a farm.
Yeah, Panama.
In Panama.
It's a nice place to start. So
it was an amazing trip, and a lot of good learnings, and a lot of interesting trials that we got to do with our cultures in this top quality of fruit that we got from there.
So fermentations, I guess, what do you see as the biggest challenges with fermentation, just generally?
Generally, I like fermentation, of course.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of fermentation. I think fermentation can bring a lot to a lot of different products. Of course, a lot of the traditional processes of coffee has been performed in order to minimize fermentation, in order to make sure that the fermentation would not spoil the product. So I think for a lot of people, when they think of fermentation of coffee, then they actually think of bad stuff and not of the good stuff. But definitely there's a tendency now that you can see more and more producers trying to push the fermentation to also gain some of the positive things that you can get from the fermentation. But this, of course, will also induce a lot of risk of spoilage from the wild flora that is performing this wild fermentation that the producers are trying to push now.
So we bring in cultures into the mix. What do you see as the role of cultures and microbes from Christian Hansen in helping this?
A good question. So as I said, the challenges are that you would have higher risk of spoilage from the wild fermentation. You might also have problems when you go up in production size, having larger batches being fermented. You have issues with having the same product every time you do a fermentation, so the repeatability is very low on these spontaneous fermentations. Bringing in cultures, you would actually be able to add control to the fermentation. You would know what happens when you add the yeast and bacteria together. Our two products that are meant to be co-fermenting to ensure that you actually know what's going to happen.
Absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit more about those two products? You have the yeast and you have the bacteria.
Exactly. So we have the yeast, the non-Saccharomyces strain. It's a product called SmartBev Boost PK1. So this product will, being a yeast, it will ferment when it gets some nutrients. There's lots of nutrients in the coffee cherry, the ripe coffee cherry, lots of sugars, lots of pectins and cellulose that it can utilize in order to boost flavor, produce some flavor, and produce some of these varietal characteristics that are already in the cherry, but making sure that they stand out clear.
So it's an interaction of that yeast and the cherry.
Exactly. It would utilize some of all the precursors that are already in the cherry, in the pulp, in the cascara skin, the skin of the fruit, and it will actually utilize these to increase the fruity flavors that are already present in the fruit.
So that's sort of why we're seeing, I guess, different results with the same yeast with different coffees.
Exactly. It will not always be the same result because, like for wine, for instance, you see applying the same yeast to 3 different wines will still give 3 different products. It will not suddenly turn into the same wine just because you apply the same yeast. So similar for coffee, when you have a different variety from a different place with a different terroir, then you would also have a different product in the end.
So it's actually preserving what's there and enhancing it.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the other product would be the SmartBev Harvest LB1 product. That is a lactic acid bacteria. So in the name lactic acid bacteria, you can really hear that there's something with lactic acid going on there, right?
Yeah. So delicious.
It comes from the dairy industry, where these bacteria are known to produce the acid known from yogurt, for instance.
So is there anything special about this particular lactic acid bacteria?
It's first of all reliable, that it will do the lactic fermentation very fast. It will initiate the lactic fermentation very fast. So within only 1 or 2 days, you will have the acid drop or the pH drop, so the acid increase and the pH drop that you would need in order to have the protection of the fermentation from spoilage microorganisms like mold or other lactic acid bacteria coming from the wild flora of the trees and the environment.
So that's super important. Obviously, you're in tropical climate and things are very volatile. It's easy to go the wrong way.
Yeah, especially if you are prone to have high risk of contamination from molds, for instance, doing drying, then you can actually have protection through the lowered pH that comes out of this fermentation with the lactic acid bacteria, which is why it's important to not only have the yeast but also have the lactic acid bacteria in order to both get the boost of varietal characteristics but also the drop in acidity, which will also bring in maybe some mouthfeel and some body to the coffee along with the protection from spoilage.
It's amazing. So a bit more freshness and a bit more quality of acid and protection.
Yeah. Of course, it's important to remember that it will not, like we just mentioned before, it's not always the same result you will get, depending on what matrix that you introduce these cultures to. So it all comes down to what is your fruit from the beginning. So you do need to have good fruit in order to produce good coffee.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you might be able to gain these fermented flavors without the risk of spoilage by introducing starter cultures.
So I guess some of the first steps has been our collaboration together. ONA Coffee and Christian Hansen working together on some of these trials has been absolutely amazing. Sure. Cannot wait to hear what you've got to say to everyone who's coming to the talk tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's an honor. It's an honor. Yeah. Far away from home.
It'd be good to drink some wines together.
Definitely.
And some great coffee. Yeah. Thank you so much. See you soon.